Ada Holloway arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, on the hottest afternoon of the summer of 1882, with nothing more than a battered leather trunk, 23 cents to her name, and a letter of employment that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The stagecoach had been brutal. 3 days from Santa Fe, with 6 other passengers packed inside like dried corn in a sack, the red dust of the territory working its way into every crease of her blue traveling dress, until she no longer felt like a woman, but like something the land was slowly absorbing. She was 24 years old, recently widowed in the most technical and tragic of senses. She had been engaged, not married, but the loss of her fiancé to a fever in the spring had felt like a marriage ending all the same, and she was entirely, frighteningly alone. The letter had come through Mrs. Greer's domestic placement agency in Santa Fe. The agency had found her sitting in the back pew of a Catholic church she did not belong to, crying quietly into her hands, 3 days after the funeral of Thomas Pelham, who had been kind and gentle and had promised her a house with a garden. Mrs. Greer herself, a compact woman with iron-gray hair and the efficient manner of someone who had spent 40 years solving other people's problems, had pressed the letter into Ada's hands as though it were a prescription. The position was simple. A woman named Nora Winslow, 71 years old, residing on the Winslow Cattle Ranch outside Cimarron, required a companion. Someone to sit with her, read to her, help her manage her correspondence, and keep her comfortable in her declining years. Her son, who ran the ranch, had arranged it through the agency. The pay was modest but included room and board. There was no mention of a return arrangement, which Ada took to mean the position was intended to last a while. She had signed the letter of acceptance with a hand that trembled only slightly. Now she stood in the street in front of the Cimarron General Store, watching the stagecoach driver wrestle her trunk down from the roof, and she looked around at the town with a feeling that was equal parts determination and dread. Cimarron was a rough-edged place, sitting at the foot of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, with the Cimarron River running brown and quick nearby. There was a saloon and a livery and a sheriff's office and a handful of storefronts, and everything was the color of dust and sun-baked wood. The mountains behind it all were extraordinary, rising blue and sharp against the white sky, and Ada decided that she could endure a great deal with mountains like that in her field of vision. She had barely arranged herself and her trunk on the boardwalk when she heard hoofbeats. A single rider came down the main street at a canter, dust rising in his wake, and pulled up in front of the general store with the kind of practiced ease that suggested the horse knew exactly where it was going even if the rider had not entirely decided yet. The man who stepped down from that horse was not what she had expected. She had imagined the son of an elderly woman to be middle-aged, perhaps soft in the middle, perhaps wearing spectacles. Abel Winslow was 31 years old and looked like he had been built specifically for the country he lived in. He was tall, with the kind of lean, hard frame that came not from vanity but from years of physical labor. His face was weathered in the way that faces weathered when they spent their days outdoors, all strong angles and sun-darkened skin, with dark eyes beneath the brim of a brown hat that was creased and shaped by years of use. He had a jaw that could have been cut from the same stone as the mountains behind him and hands that were large and rope-scarred. He looked at her and she looked at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Miss Holloway," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been told to expect someone, and she was the only woman standing alone on the boardwalk with a trunk. "Mr. Winslow," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice was. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat in the minimal greeting that seemed to be the custom out here. "I'll load your trunk. The wagon is around back." He paused, looking at her more carefully, and she had the distinct feeling that he was assessing her the way he might assess a horse he was considering purchasing, noting her qualities and finding them either adequate or inadequate. Whatever he decided, he did not share it. He turned and lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, and she followed him around the side of the building to where a buckboard wagon waited with two good sorrel horses. The ride to the ranch was 40 minutes along a road that wound through scrub, brush, and juniper, climbing slightly into the foothills, with the mountains growing larger ahead of them. Abel Winslow did not talk much. He answered her questions with economy, explaining that the ranch was some 3,000 acres, that they ran about 200 head of cattle, that he had 4 hands working for him year-round and more during roundup. He told her that his mother had been ill for some months, that she tired easily and slept a great deal, but that she was in good spirits and would be glad of the company. He said this last part with something that might have been relief, as though the responsibility of his mother's loneliness weighed on him, and he was glad to be transferring some portion of it to capable hands. Ada asked what kind of things his mother liked, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. The hardness softened just fractionally, like ice at the edge of a river beginning to loosen in early spring. "She likes to be read to," he said. "She was a great reader when her eyes were better. She likes conversation. She likes knowing what is happening in the world even if she can no longer participate in it." He paused. "She is a remarkable woman. She built this ranch with my father 20 years ago when this was country that would frighten most men, let alone women. She has never frightened easily." Ada thought that she liked the sound of Nora Winslow very much. The ranch, when it came into view, was a genuine surprise. She had expected something rough and utilitarian, but what she found was a low, sprawling adobe house with a wide covered porch running along its front, shaded by cottonwood trees whose leaves caught the evening light and turned it silver. There were flower beds along the porch railing, somewhat overgrown but still blooming with yellow and red, and a kitchen garden visible around the side that suggested someone had once kept it with considerable care. The outbuildings were solid and well-maintained, and the whole property had the feeling of a place that had been built to last. A ranch hand named Court, a weathered man of about 50 with a white mustache and a missing finger on his left hand, took the horses as they pulled in. He touched his hat to Ada with old-fashioned courtesy. Another hand she glimpsed near the barn, a young man no older than 20 named Birch who had the look of someone recently arrived to the territory, watched her with open curiosity from a safe distance. Abel carried her trunk inside himself rather than leaving it for someone else, which she noticed. He showed her to a room at the back of the house that was simple but adequate. A good iron bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, a window that faced the mountains. The mountains, she thought, good. She could endure a great deal with that view. "My mother is resting," he said, standing in the doorway of her room with his hat in his hands. "I will take you to her in an hour." "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left, and Ada sat down on the edge of the bed and breathed in and out 3 times and told herself she was going to be all right. An hour later, she stood at the door of Nora Winslow's room, and the old woman who looked up at her from the bed was small and thin and white-haired, with eyes that were still sharp and dark and full of intelligence. She had been beautiful once, and the architecture of that beauty was still visible in the line of her cheekbones and the set of her chin. She was, Ada saw immediately, genuinely ill. The pallor was not simply the pallor of age, and her breathing had a labored quality that was difficult to disguise. But she smiled when she saw Ada, and it was a warm, genuine smile. "You must be my Ada," she said, and Ada was so startled by the possessive that she almost stepped back. "My Ada." As though she already belonged here. "Yes, ma'am," she said, and crossed the room and took the old woman's hand. They talked for 2 hours. Ada read to her from a copy of a newspaper that was only 4 days old, which Nora declared a miracle of modernity. And then Nora talked about the ranch and about Abel and about a life that had been hard and full and occasionally glorious, lived in the high desert country of New Mexico territory since before the railroad had pushed through and changed the character of everything. She had a gift for storytelling, Nora Winslow did, and Ada found herself leaning forward in her chair, thoroughly absorbed, laughing at the right moments and quiet at the right moments. Abel looked in twice. Both times he found his mother looking more animated than she had in weeks, and both times he looked at Ada with an expression she could not quite interpret, something between gratitude and something else she didn't have a name for yet. At 9 o'clock, Ada helped Nora settle for the night, brought her a cup of warm water with a little honey because the old woman said it helped her throat, and sat beside her until her eyes closed and her breathing evened into sleep. Then Ada went to her own room and lay down in her clothes because she was too tired to change properly, and she fell asleep to the sound of coyotes somewhere out on the flat and the distant low lowing of cattle, and she thought, just before sleep took her, that perhaps this was going to be all right after all. She was woken at 4 in the morning by the sound of Abel Winslow's voice saying her name outside her door. His voice was quiet but taut, stretched thin over something she recognized immediately, without having to be told, as grief. She was at the door in seconds, her feet on the cold floorboards, her hair loose down her back. Nora Winslow had died in her sleep. The doctor, when he came out from Cimarron in the early morning, said it had been her heart. Peaceful, he said, which was the word men used when they meant painless, which was the only comfort available in those circumstances. She had been declining for months, he said, looking at Abel with a kind of professional gentleness. It was not unexpected. Abel received this information in the silence of a man who had perhaps suspected it and had perhaps been hoping he was wrong. He stood in the kitchen while the doctor talked, his hat in his hands again, turning it slowly by the brim in the way Ada had already learned was his habit when he was working something out internally. He was still dressed in the clothes he'd been wearing the day before, which meant he hadn't slept. Ada made coffee. She didn't ask if he wanted it. She simply made it and put a cup in front of him and then stood back and let him have his grief without interference. He looked at the coffee and then looked at her, and his dark eyes were so full of something raw and unguarded that she had to resist the impulse to reach out and touch his arm. "I need to send word to my sister in Denver," he said, "and to my mother's brother in Texas. I can help you write the letters," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She understood what he was not saying. He had brought her out here for his mother, and his mother was gone, and there was no longer a position for her to fill. She was, technically, without employment before she had even properly begun. She watched the realization cross his face and she lifted her chin slightly, because she was not going to make this harder for him by looking frightened, even if she was. "Miss Holloway," he said, and then stopped. "I understand the situation has changed," she said carefully. He looked around the kitchen as though seeing it fresh, and then he looked at the stove, which was cold, and the shelves, which were somewhat disorganized, and the general state of the house, which bore all the hallmarks of a household managed by men who were competent at everything except domestic management. He looked at the parlor beyond, where his mother's chair sat empty beside the cold fireplace. He looked, finally, back at Ada. "I have 4 men to feed 3 times a day," he said. "I have a house that has not been properly looked after in 6 months because my mother was too ill to manage it, and I do not have time to manage it myself. I have books that need to be kept for the ranch. I have correspondence that has piled up since March." He paused. "I would be grateful if you would stay." The relief she felt was large enough that she had to look away for a moment and breathe through it carefully. "I will stay," she said. He nodded. "I'll pay you a proper wage, not a companion's wage, a housekeeper's wage, which is better." He said this with a faint note of something, not embarrassment exactly, but the dignity of a man who did not want anyone to think he was taking advantage of circumstances. "That is very fair," she said. "Good," he said, and drank his coffee. She wrote the letters that morning, sitting at the small desk in the parlor that had clearly been Nora's domain, with neat stacks of papers and a good pen and a bottle of ink. Abel dictated and she wrote, and she tried not to think too hard about the fact that she was putting words to things that were breaking someone's heart. The funeral was 3 days later, held on a clear, brilliant September morning, with the mountains standing up behind everything like a promise. The minister came from Cimarron, and there were neighbors, other ranching families from the valley, who arrived in wagons and on horseback, which surprised Ada until she remembered that Nora had apparently been in this country for 20 years, and that 2 decades was enough time to become essential to a community. Abel's sister came from Denver. Her name was Margaret, and she was 3 years younger than Abel and looked like her mother, small and dark-eyed, with a sharp, assessing quality to her gaze that she turned on Ada within 30 seconds of their introduction, with an intensity that Ada found both flattering and slightly alarming. "You are the companion," Margaret said, in a tone that could have been a statement or a challenge, possibly both. "I was hired as one," Ada said. "I am staying on as housekeeper." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "My brother is 31 years old and has been alone on this ranch since my father died 4 years ago and my mother's health declined," she said quietly. "I want him to be happy." Ada was not entirely sure what to do with that statement, so she said, "Yes, ma'am," and left it there. After the funeral, after the neighbors had come and eaten and expressed their condolences and gone home, after Margaret had pressed Abel's face between her hands and said something in a low voice that made him close his eyes briefly and then nod, Margaret sought Ada out in the kitchen. "You are capable," she said, watching Ada organize the remaining food with efficiency. "And you are kind. I could see how you were with the neighbors today, making sure everyone had what they needed without being asked." "Thank you," Ada said. "Take care of him," Margaret said, "not as a task, as a person. He works too hard and he speaks too little, and he has forgotten, I think, that a life can be more than the management of a property." Ada looked at her steadily. "I will do my best," she said. Margaret left the next morning, back to Denver, back to her husband and her 2 children and her life, and the ranch settled into its new configuration. Ada and Abel and 4 ranch hands, the mountains watching from the west, the river running in its bed below the property line, the cattle moving in slow, purposeful patterns across the grassland. Ada threw herself into the work with the whole force of a woman who had learned that activity was the surest defense against grief. She organized the kitchen and cataloged the pantry and established a system for the ranch's books that was clean and logical, and turned the quarterly accounting from a chaos of receipts and loose papers into something Abel could actually read. She planted the kitchen garden back into order, working in the early mornings before the heat came, her hands in the dark, rich soil, her hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to Nora, and that Abel had pressed into her hands on the second day with a slightly awkward look and no explanation. The ranch hands regarded her with a cautious respect that warmed gradually into something more genuine. Court, the oldest hand, treated her with an old-fashioned courtliness that she found touching. Birch, the young one, began appearing in the kitchen at odd hours looking hopefully at the stove, and she fed him with a mixture of exasperation and amusement, because he reminded her of a younger brother she had once had who had died of a fever at 12. And feeding people was how she expressed affection when she did not yet have the words. There were 2 other hands, a quiet, serious man named Walt who barely spoke, but always left his dishes washed without being asked, and a Mexican cowboy named Segundo who had worked for the Winslows since Abel's father was alive, and who had a kind of weathered, ironic dignity that Ada respected enormously. Segundo had known Nora Winslow for nearly 2 decades, and mourned her with a restraint that was somehow more affecting than open grief. Abel himself was a puzzle she was not yet equipped to solve. He was in the saddle before dawn every morning and rarely back at the house before dark, and when he was present, he was quiet and self-contained in the way of a man who has spent years organizing himself around solitude. But he was not unfriendly. He was precise and fair, and he had a quality she slowly recognized as consideration, a habit of thinking about the effect of his actions on the people around him that expressed itself not in words but in small acts. The hat that had belonged to his mother, the way he made sure the woodbox was always full before she had to ask. The fact that when he came in at the end of the day and found her still working at the books, he would simply pull up a chair on the other side of the desk and work through his own paperwork in companionable silence rather than sending her to bed. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when she first saw him laugh. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the one day the ranch ran at a slower pace, when Birch had somehow managed to let one of the smaller calves into the kitchen garden, and the calf was eating Ada's lettuce with an expression of profound satisfaction, while Ada attempted to herd it out with a broom and failed repeatedly because the calf thought this was an excellent game. Abel came around the corner of the house to find the situation in full crisis, and she turned to look at him with what she was certain was an expression of absolute exasperation and helplessness. And he laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, a full, unguarded sound that transformed his face entirely and made him look younger and more open and considerably more dangerous to her peace of mind. He took the broom from her without a word and had the calf back over the fence in 2 minutes, and then he turned back to her, and his expression was still warm with the remains of the laughter, and he looked at the damaged lettuce row and then back at her, and she started laughing too, because there was really nothing else to do. "I'll have Birch fix that fence properly," he said. "Please do," she said, and she was still smiling, and he was still smiling, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the Sunday afternoon light for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before Ada turned back to survey the damage and Abel went to find Birch. The smile stayed with her for the rest of the day. She was not entirely sure what to do about that. October came and brought cool nights and brilliant days, the aspens in the foothills turning gold and the air carrying the first bite of the coming winter. Ada had been at the ranch for 6 weeks, and she had settled into the life of it so completely that she sometimes startled herself by forgetting that she had not always been here. She had ceased to be an outsider within the house. She had earned a kind of membership in the daily operations of the ranch that felt genuine rather than provisional. She had also accumulated a considerable amount of evidence that Abel Winslow was not quite as self-sufficient as he appeared. He ate badly when left to his own devices, which she discovered on the 3 occasions when she had been in Cimarron for supplies, and returned to find that he had fed himself and the hands on nothing but salt pork and day-old biscuits, rather than use the fresh provisions she had left prepared. He was incapable of finding anything in the house that had been moved from its original position, which she learned when she reorganized the storage room, and he spent 20 minutes looking for a specific piece of harness equipment she had relocated to a more logical position. He had headaches that he did not mention and attributed to nothing in particular, which she eventually connected to the fact that he read documents in bad light and needed spectacles, but had not gotten around to doing anything about it. She ordered the spectacles herself, writing to a supplier in Santa Fe with the measurements she estimated from careful observation, and presented them to him 3 weeks later when they arrived with the mail. He looked at them and then looked at her with an expression she could not entirely decipher. "How did you know?" he started. "You squint," she said simply. "Wear them." He wore them. He was quiet about it, but she noticed the headache stopped. One evening in mid-October, she was sitting on the porch after supper, working on a letter to her older sister in Ohio, the last family she had, a pragmatic woman named Ruth who wrote back with dependable regularity, and whom Ada missed with a steadiness that was almost comfortable in its familiarity, when Abel came out and sat in the other porch chair. He had a cup of coffee, and he sat with the particular quality of a man who has not quite decided whether he intends to speak or simply to be in proximity, which Ada had learned to read correctly, and so she said nothing and kept writing. After a while he said, "Do you miss Santa Fe?" She considered the question honestly. "I miss certain things about it," she said. "I miss the markets. I miss the women I knew through the agency." She paused. "I do not miss feeling that I was waiting for my life to begin." He looked at her sideways. The evening was very quiet around them, just the sound of the river somewhere below and the nighthawks beginning their hunting passes against the darkening sky. Was that what it felt like? "Yes," she said. After Thomas died, my fiancé, I spent several months feeling as though I was standing in a room where all the furniture had been removed, present in the room but with nothing to arrange myself in relation to. She paused, slightly surprised at herself at how easily this was coming out. This, she said, gesturing vaguely at the ranch, the mountains, the sky, is furniture. There is work here, there is purpose. He was quiet for a moment. I am sorry about your fiancé, he said. Thank you, she said. I am sorry about your mother. Yes, he said, and then after a pause, she would have liked you. Ada looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, his profile clean and still against the fading sky. I liked her, Ada said. In the 2 hours I had with her, I liked her very much. 2 hours, he said, and something crossed his face. She got you for 2 hours and then left. She seemed, Ada said carefully, like a woman who knew what she was doing. Abel turned to look at her then, and there was something in his expression that was both questioning and reluctant, as though he had understood something he was not yet ready to examine directly. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he turned back to the mountains. Yes, he said, she generally did. November brought the first real cold, a hard freeze in the first week that killed the last of the garden and put ice on the water troughs in the mornings, and required Ada to add a second quilt to every bed in the house. It also brought something Ada had not anticipated: proximity. The house, which in the warm months could be navigated with a comfortable degree of separation, became smaller in the cold. The main room with its fireplace was the warm heart of the house, and in the evenings everyone gathered there, Ada with her sewing or her books or the ranch ledgers, Abel with his papers, sometimes Court or Segundo coming in from the bunkhouse for a hand of cards or a conversation. But often it was just the two of them, on opposite sides of the fireplace, with the cold outside and the firelight doing what firelight does to a room and to faces, and Ada became acutely aware that she was not, in fact, entirely immune to Abel Winslow. She was not a foolish woman. She had lived enough life at 24 to know the difference between attraction and affection, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that what she was developing for Abel combined both in uncomfortable quantities. He was, when she was being thorough about it, the kind of man that a woman who had been raised to value competence and steadiness could not easily dismiss, not because he was handsome, though he was, but because he was good. She could see it in the way he treated his hands, with fairness and without condescension. She could see it in the way he talked about his mother. She could see it in the small, private considerations he extended to her daily, without appearing to calculate them. The problem was that she was his housekeeper. She was an employee who had arrived under awkward circumstances and was staying by his generosity. And she was not the kind of woman who confused professional reliance for something more meaningful simply because the evenings were long and the firelight was warm. She kept her feelings organized behind a pleasant, professional manner and told herself this was the sensible approach. She had not accounted for the fact that Abel Winslow, while not a demonstrably communicative man, was capable of surprising her. It happened on a Saturday in the second week of November. Ada had ridden into Cimarron for supplies. Abel had taught her to ride competently in the first month, recognizing that a woman who could not ride in this country was a woman who was stranded, and on her way back she had been caught in the first serious snowstorm of the season. It had come from the northwest with the speed and lack of apology that was characteristic of New Mexico Territory weather, turning the sky white and the road difficult within 15 minutes. She had kept the horse on the road by feel and instinct and sheer refusal to panic, and she had been nearly back to the ranch when Abel appeared on the road ahead of her, coming toward her at a hard canter through the snow, looking like a man in whom several strong emotions were competing. He pulled up beside her and took one look at her, snow-covered, hands white around the reins, jaw set in the particular way she knew meant she was managing something difficult, and the expression on his face did something complicated, relief and something more heated than relief, both at once. "I was coming to find you," he said. "I am quite all right," she said, which was true. "I know," he said. "I was coming anyway." They rode back to the ranch side by side through the snow, and she was more aware of him than she had been before, which had not been a comfortable level of awareness to begin with. That evening, after supper, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, she came downstairs from checking that all the windows were properly closed against the cold and found Abel standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow. He heard her on the stairs and turned around, and she saw that he had the spectacles on, which he wore in the evenings when he was not expecting to be observed, and there was something about the sight of him in the firelight wearing spectacles he'd received from her hands that hit her somewhere south of her sternum. "You were not afraid," he said, "in the storm." "I was a little afraid," she admitted. "You did not show it." "Showing it would not have helped the horse navigate," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Ada," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, and they both registered it at the same moment, and there was a brief, charged silence. "Mr. Winslow," she said, because she was not going to compound it by using his first name in return, not yet, not while she was not certain. But something had shifted perceptibly and permanently, like a door that had been moved slightly off its hinge. December was cold and beautiful and busy, because winter on a cattle ranch was not a quiet season regardless of what people who had never lived on one imagined. There were fences to maintain, feed to haul, ice to break on the troughs every morning, and the constant arithmetic of managing livestock through weather that could turn dangerous without warning. Abel was present in the house more in winter than in other seasons, because some of the work moved indoors planning, accounting, ordering supplies for the spring. And Ada found that she had numerous opportunities to observe him at close range in the steady light of the kitchen or the warmth of the parlor. She also discovered that he could cook, badly but with sincerity, and on the one Sunday morning when she had been ill with a head cold and stayed in bed, he had brought her a bowl of something that was technically soup, and had sat on the edge of the chair by her door with the stiff uncertainty of a man who was not accustomed to nursing situations and said, "Court said this was how to make it. I may have gotten the proportions wrong." The soup was thin and slightly salty, and she ate every bit of it. She was also, in December, confronted with the question of Christmas, which she had not thought about until Court asked her one morning over coffee whether she was planning to cook a proper Christmas dinner. She looked at him, and he looked at the kitchen around her, and they both understood without saying it that Christmas on this ranch had not been properly observed since before Nora's health declined. "Yes," she said, "I am planning exactly that." She wrote to her sister Ruth in Ohio, and received back a letter full of warmth and 2 recipes, one for a honey cake that had been their mother's, and one for a roasted sweet potato dish that their grandmother had made every Christmas of Ada's childhood. She ordered dried fruit from the general store in Cimarron and put up spiced apples from the last of the cellar stock and made the kitchen smell, for the 10 days before Christmas, like somewhere that time had curved back to something kinder. Abel noticed. She could see it in the way he came into the kitchen more often than strictly necessary in those 10 days, and in the way he sometimes stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and inhaled with an expression that was so open and unguarded that she had to look away to give him the privacy of it. On Christmas Eve, she asked him to help her bring the good china down from the high shelf where it had apparently been stored since his father's death, and he stood on a chair and handed pieces down to her one at a time while she held her breath, because the china was clearly old and clearly precious, hand-painted blue and white pieces that had been carried out from Missouri on a wagon 20 years ago by Nora Winslow, who had apparently been willing to sacrifice food weight for beauty. "These were my mother's wedding china," he said, handing down a gravy boat with the particular care of a man handling something irreplaceable. "I know," she said. "I found the receipt in the correspondence box." 1860. She bought them in St. Louis. He stepped down from the chair and looked at the pieces arranged on the kitchen table and then looked at her. "You have been reading through all of my mother's correspondence," he said, not accusatory, something else. "I have been organizing it," she said carefully. "There were letters from your father among them. I set those aside. I thought you might want them separately." He was very still. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Thank you." She had wrapped them in a piece of cloth and tied it with ribbon she had found in Nora's sewing basket, and she gave them to him on Christmas morning without ceremony, handing the package across the breakfast table while Court and Birch and Walt and Segundo were eating their eggs and ignoring the transaction with the elaborate tact of men who understood that something private was occurring. He held the package for a moment without opening it, and then he looked at her and said simply, "Thank you, Ada." There it was again, her name. Plain and direct and warm, she said, "You are welcome, Abel," and the world did not end, but it certainly changed. Christmas dinner was the best meal the Winslow Ranch had seen in years, by Court's estimation, delivered with the authority of a man who had been eating there for a decade. There was a roasted joint of beef and sweet potatoes and biscuits and preserved vegetables from the cellar, and at the end, the honey cake from her mother's recipe, which came out golden and fragrant, and which every person at the table ate 2 pieces of without apology. After dinner, the hands retired to the bunkhouse, and Ada and Abel sat in the parlor with the fire going and the house quiet around them, and Abel had poured 2 small glasses of whiskey from a bottle that Segundo had given him as a Christmas gift, and he held one out to Ada with a questioning look. She took it. She was not much given to whiskey, but it was Christmas, and the fire was warm, and things were different tonight in a way she did not quite want to analyze. They talked for a long time. Not about the ranch, not about accounts or fences or supply orders. He told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father who had been a quiet, solid man with a talent for land and a deep love for his wife. He told her about the years after his father died, the 4 years of managing the ranch alone while his mother's health declined, the weight of it, the particular loneliness of being responsible for everything and uncertain about everything, and having no one to talk to at the end of the day who could understand what he was managing. She told him about Ohio, about her parents who had both died when she was 17, about Ruth who had married and stayed in the East, and about her own decision to come west, which had seemed reckless to everyone who knew her and which she had known, even at 20, was the right choice. She told him about Thomas Pelham, more than she had told anyone since his death, and she was surprised to find that it did not hurt the way she expected. It hurt the way old things hurt, with a gentle ache rather than the sharp, breathtaking pain of fresh loss. "Were you very much in love with him?" Abel asked, and his voice was careful, as though he was asking a question he had been turning over for some time. "I was fond of him," she said honestly. "I believe it would have grown into love. He was a good man." She paused. "I think I was more in love with the idea of not being alone than I was with Thomas specifically, which is a terrible thing to say about someone who was kind and deserved better than that." Abel was quiet for a moment. "I think most people are partly in love with the idea when they are young," he said. "It takes time to understand what love actually is." She looked at him. The firelight was doing its work on his face, and his dark eyes were steady and direct, and she was very aware of the way this conversation had moved, incrementally and without declaration, into territory that was no longer professionally appropriate and was entirely, helplessly real. "What do you think it is?" she asked. He considered this with the thoroughness he brought to everything. "Choosing," he said finally, "repeatedly, even when it is inconvenient or frightening or uncertain." He paused. "And wanting the other person to be comfortable and well and satisfied with their life more than you want to be comfortable yourself." She was quiet for a long time after that. "That is a good answer," she said softly. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of the habitual reserve that he wore the way other men wore hats, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was in love with Abel Winslow. Not in the fond, provisional way she had been in love with Thomas. In the real way, the way he had just described, the way that was inconvenient and frightening and entirely certain. She did not say so. She was not yet brave enough, or sure enough of what she was reading in his face. She said good night and went to her room and lay awake for a long time listening to the winter wind against the windows and the sound of the fire dying in the parlor below. January arrived with a ferocity that was almost personal. The temperature dropped to levels that made outdoor work genuinely punishing, and a blizzard in the second week of the month kept everyone confined to the house and bunkhouse for 3 days. Ada found that she did not mind the confinement as much as she might have expected. The house was warm and well-provisioned, and there was something oddly cozy about being snowbound in a place that had become, quietly, and without her fully realizing it, home. Abel used the blizzard days to work on a set of plans he had been carrying in his head for some time, a proposal to expand the ranch's water management, diverting a portion of the river to create a more reliable watering system for the cattle in the dry months. He spread the plans across the dining table and worked on them with the focused, particular intensity he brought to problems he considered important. And Ada found herself drawn in, asking questions, understanding the geography from her months of riding the land, making suggestions that he received with a seriousness that made her chest feel warm. On the second day of the blizzard, Segundo, who had a philosophical turn of mind that expressed itself in the form of occasional, well-timed observations, said to Ada while she was making lunch and Abel was in the next room with his plans, "He was very different before you came." She kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "How so?" "Silent," Segundo said. "Not quiet, silent. There is a difference. A quiet man has thoughts he is comfortable keeping. A silent man has thoughts he does not know what to do with." He paused. "He talks now." Ada said nothing. "It is good," Segundo said simply and took his coffee back to the table. She thought about that for the rest of the day. On the third day of the blizzard, in the late afternoon when the light had turned blue and still outside the windows and the house was very quiet, Ada was in the kitchen and she heard Abel come to the kitchen doorway and stop. She turned around and he was standing there with a look on his face that she had never seen before, a look of having arrived at a decision through a process that had been long and perhaps difficult. "Ada," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to." He stopped. He was not accustomed to this kind of speech. She could see it, the difficulty of translating internal certainty into words. "I have been thinking," he said, trying again, "that the situation here has become, that is, I am aware that you came here under particular circumstances and that the arrangement we have is professional in nature, and I would not want you to feel." He stopped again. She set down the spoon she was holding. "Abel," she said. He looked at her. "Are you trying to tell me something or ask me something?" A pause. "Ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said, and she was proud of how steady she sounded. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood close enough that she could see the particular dark of his eyes and the way the cold had left color on his cheekbones, and he said, "Would you consider the possibility of becoming more than my housekeeper?" The directness of it, after all the careful preamble, startled a breath out of her that was almost a laugh. Not a laughing matter, she told herself immediately, because it was not. It was the most serious question she had been asked in years. "I would consider it," she said carefully. "I would consider it seriously." Something in his face changed, a tension she had not fully seen releasing, and he said, "I am not a man who is easy to know." "I have noticed," she said. "I have also known you for 4 months, and I believe I know you better than you think." "What do you know?" he said, and it was a genuine question, not a challenge. She thought about it honestly. "I know you are fair," she said. "I know you are loyal to the people who depend on you. I know you put other people's well-being ahead of your own comfort, consistently and without making a show of it. I know you laugh when you think no one is going to use it against you." She paused. "I know you grieve deeply and quietly and do not ask for help with it." She paused again. "I know you came out in a blizzard to find me in a snowstorm even though I was perfectly all right." He was very still, listening to her with that complete grave attention that was one of the things she loved about him. "And I know," she said, her voice steady but softer, "that you brought me a bowl of soup when I was ill, and it was the worst soup I have ever eaten, and it was one of the kindest things anyone has done for me in years." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more honest than a laugh. "Ada," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you," he said. "Properly." "If you are willing." "I am willing," she said, "very much." He reached out and took her hand, which was still faintly warm from the stove, and held it with the same careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. His thumb moved once gently across her knuckles. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was, she thought, the most intimate thing anyone had ever done to her. They stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, the blizzard outside and the fire in the stove beside them. And then he said, "Supper should not burn." And she said, "No, it should not." And she turned back to the stove, and he stayed in the kitchen while she cooked, leaning against the wall and watching her with the warmth still in his face. And she thought this. This is what he meant by choosing, repeatedly, even when it is frightening, even when you are not certain. She was certain now. Spring came back to the Winslow Ranch in the slow, gorgeous way it came to the high desert country of New Mexico Territory, starting with the first tentative warmth in the afternoons, and building through March and April into something that felt like the land exhaling after a long-held breath. The aspens put out their first pale green, and the meadow grass came back in the lower pastures, and the calving season kept Abel and his hands working from before dawn until after dark for 3 solid weeks. Ada brought food out to the barn during calving because nobody had time to come in. She would appear in the barn doorway in the early morning with coffee and biscuits and a lantern, and Abel would look up from whatever crisis he was managing, and his face would do the thing she loved, that specific, involuntary lightening when he saw her, as though something inside him had decided she was a reliable good thing in the world and responded to her presence accordingly. She had written to Ruth in February and told her about Abel. Not everything, but enough. A rancher in New Mexico, a good man. She was developing feelings of some seriousness. Ruth's reply had taken 3 weeks and had contained so much enthusiasm packed into its 3 tightly written pages that Ada had laughed until tears came, and then she had been slightly homesick for a day or two, which was the first time she had been homesick since arriving at the ranch. Abel noticed the homesickness without her mentioning it. He noticed it in the way he noticed most things, quietly, from a slight distance, and without making a production of it. He came to her one afternoon and said that he had been thinking about whether she would like to invite her sister to visit, and that the ranch could accommodate guests, and the summer months were a reasonable time for travel. She looked at him. "You noticed I was sad," she said. "You were looking at your sister's letters," he said. "You had a particular expression. You were watching me read my private correspondence. I was working on the other side of the table," he said with dignity, "and I observed your expression." She wanted to be exasperated and could not quite manage it. "I would like very much to have my sister visit," she said. "Then write and ask her," he said, and went back to his ledgers. She wrote, and Ruth responded with a rapidity that suggested she had been waiting for the invitation, and plans were made for a visit in July. In the meantime, spring deepened toward summer, and Ada and Abel moved through a courtship that was conducted in the manner of the country they lived in, not in parlors with chaperones and calling cards, but in the daily, physical life of the ranch. He rode with her on Sundays when he was not entirely consumed by work, showing her the back portions of the property she had not yet seen, the high meadows where the grass was thick, and the air was cold and clean even in July. The old stone corral his father had built in the first years of the ranch, the stretch of the Cimarron River that ran through the eastern boundary, where the cottonwoods grew so thick the light came through them green and shifting like light through water. He talked more than he had, incrementally and with the air of a man learning a new skill, and she listened well and asked questions that were not intrusive but that created openings. And slowly, the story of Abel Winslow filled in around her in the way that a landscape fills in when you walk through it rather than observing it from a distance. He was a man who had inherited responsibility early and carried it without complaint, and had not in the process thought to consider whether he himself wanted things. The ranch had taken up all the available space, and the ranch was genuinely worthy of devotion, but she thought that he had confused devotion to the ranch with the whole of a life, and that the confusion had been comfortable enough and lonely enough in equal measure. She told him this, on one of their Sunday rides, more directly than she had intended, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You are not wrong," with the frankness she had learned to expect from him. "Do you resent it?" she asked. "The responsibility? No," he said. "It is mine and I chose it." He paused. "But I think I forgot that choosing one thing does not mean relinquishing everything else." He looked at her, riding beside him in the golden late afternoon, her dark hair escaping from its pins as it always did on horseback. "I think I needed reminding of that." She held his gaze for a moment. "Then I am glad I stayed," she said. "So am I," he said simply, and the simplicity of it was, as always, more devastating than anything elaborate could have been. Ruth Holloway arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday in the middle of July, off the afternoon stage, and she turned out to be everything Ada had described, and several things she had not. A sturdy, cheerful woman of 30 with Ada's dark eyes and their mother's determined chin, who took one look at Abel when he helped her down from the wagon, and gave Ada a look over his shoulder that communicated, with the efficiency of a woman who had shared a childhood bedroom with Ada, that she found him entirely acceptable. Abel, to his credit, was genuinely warm with Ruth, which Ada had not entirely anticipated given his usual economy with strangers. But Ruth was direct and funny and unfrightened by silence, and Abel, after the first careful evening, clearly decided she was trustworthy and relaxed accordingly. On the second day of her visit, Ruth found Ada alone in the kitchen garden in the morning and said, without preamble, "Ada, that man is in love with you." Ada kept weeding. "We are courting," she said. "I am aware," Ruth said, crouching down to help pull a weed. "I am saying he is in love with you, not courtship fond, actually in love. The way he watches you when you are not watching him should probably be illegal." Ada sat back on her heels. "You have been here 36 hours. "I have been observing for 36 hours, Ruth said. "There is a difference." She brushed the dirt from her hands. "Are you in love with him?" "Yes," Ada said without hesitation. "Good," Ruth said with satisfaction. "Then get on with it." "It is not always that simple," Ada said. "It frequently is," Ruth said, "and people only make it complicated because they are afraid." Ada thought about this for the remainder of the day. That evening, after supper, Ruth manufactured an errand to the bunkhouse that fooled no one and left Ada and Abel alone on the porch in the long summer twilight. Ada could feel him watching her, the quality of attention she had come to know like weather present before it was visible in the pressure of the air. She turned to look at him directly. "My sister says you are in love with me," she said. He showed no surprise, which was itself informative. "Your sister is observant," he said. "Are you going to tell me she is wrong?" He met her eyes steadily. "No," he said. "She is not wrong," Ada breathed. "Then why have you not said so?" "Because," he said, with the measured precision of a man who has thought about this, "I wanted to be certain that you had arrived at something of your own accord, and not simply because you were grateful or lonely or because this was the situation you found yourself in. I did not want you to feel that staying here required you to." He stopped. "I wanted your choice to be free." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought of the letter she had read 50 times, the one that had brought her here, the elderly woman she had liked for 2 hours, the hat that had been pressed into her hands on her second day, the soup, the spectacles, the ride out into a snowstorm, the plans for the water system spread across the dining table, Sunday rides through the high meadows, a man who had watched over her from a careful distance and called it consideration, and it was consideration. It was the most generous kind. "Abel," she said. "Ada, I love you," she said. "It is not gratitude, it is not circumstance. I am a person who arrived here from a place of grief, and I found work I valued and a life that felt real, and I found you, who are good and steady and funny when you think no one will use it against you, and I love you. That is a free choice. That is the freest choice I have made." He was still for a moment, and then he was out of his chair and she was on her feet without having decided to stand, and he took her face in his hands with the particular careful attention he brought to fragile things. And he kissed her in the summer twilight on the porch of the ranch his mother had built and his father had loved and he had kept faithfully through hard years. And the mountains were behind them, and the river was below them, and the first stars were appearing overhead. And it was, Ada thought, in the brief moment before thought became irrelevant, exactly what he had said. It was choosing. It was the simplest and most complete thing in the world. Ruth, looking out the window from the bunkhouse path, turned around and walked all the way to the far end of the bunkhouse before coming back, giving them a reasonable interval. And nobody mentioned this later because everyone was too well-bred. Abel asked Ada to marry him on a September morning, 1 full year after her arrival at the ranch, on the porch before breakfast with the coffee steam rising and the mountains lit gold in the early light. He did it with directness and without artifice, which was how he did everything, standing in front of her with both her hands held in both of his and his dark eyes entirely unguarded. "I want you to be my wife," he said. "I want this to be your ranch as much as it is mine. I want to build the years here with you." He paused. "I cannot promise you that it will always be easy. It is a hard country, but I will promise you that I will choose you, every morning without exception." She thought of a church pew in Santa Fe and a letter folded soft at the seams and a woman of 71 who had said "my Ada" with such certainty as though she already knew. "Yes," Ada said. "Yes, absolutely yes." The wedding was held in November at the ranch, because Ada had come to love the ranch in all its seasons and would not be married anywhere else. The minister came from Cimarron, and the neighbors came from across the valley, and Ruth came from Ohio with her husband Henry, who turned out to be a cheerful, square-shouldered man who shook Abel's hand with genuine warmth, and who spent most of the day talking cattle with Court and Segundo, and appeared to find this the finest possible use of a Saturday. Margaret came from Denver with her husband and her 2 children, and she embraced Ada at the door of the house with the fervor of a woman whose wish had been granted in full, and said, into Ada's hair, she would have been so pleased. And Ada held her tightly and thought yes, she would, and understood that this too was Nora's gift, this belonging. The ceremony was in the afternoon, in the parlor that Ada had made beautiful with branches of autumn aspen and dried wildflowers, and the blue and white wedding china on the sideboard. She wore a dress that was a deep blue, not a traditional bridal white, which was impractical in this country, but the color of the mountains in the evening, and Abel wore his good suit and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for a year, that steady, specific attention, but now with something more in it, something he was no longer containing. She walked across the parlor to him, and he took her hand, and they made their promises in front of everyone they loved, simply and without ornamentation. And when the minister pronounced them married and Abel kissed her, the room made the kind of involuntary warm sound that rooms make when something right happens inside them. Court cried. He denied it immediately and blamed the fire smoke, and everyone agreed with great tact that it was certainly the fire smoke. Supper was a feast. Ada had been cooking and preparing for days, with Margaret and Ruth both pressed into service with considerable good humor. And afterward there was music because Birch turned out to own a fiddle and had been concealing his ability to play it for reasons he could not adequately explain. And the parlor was pushed back and there was dancing, improbable and joyful, in the November warm house, while the cold stars counted themselves outside the windows. Late in the evening, when the guests had thinned and the fire had settled and Ruth was asleep in the second bedroom with Henry, and Margaret and her husband had retired to the room that had been made up for them, Abel found Ada standing at the parlor window looking at the night. He came and stood beside her, close, their shoulders touching. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "1 year," he said. "1 year," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood for a moment with the dark land spread out before them under the winter stars, familiar and vast, and the lights of the bunkhouse visible through the cottonwoods, and the mountains present even in darkness, felt rather than seen, enormous and steady and permanent. Nora knew, Ada said. He made a sound, not disagreement. She arranged it, Ada said. I do not believe in the way that makes for good arguments, but I believe it as a feeling, that she knew exactly what she was doing. My mother, he said, with a warmth in his voice that was long-standing and still fresh, was a woman who knew what she was doing. Ada smiled and he tightened his arm around her, and they stood there in the last minutes of their wedding day and thought, separately and together, about the mysterious and practical workings of love. The years that followed were built, as Abel had promised, stone by stone and choice by choice. The water management project was completed in the spring following their marriage, and the improvement to the ranch was significant enough that neighboring ranches asked Abel about the design, and he explained it with the straightforward generosity of a man who believed in sharing what worked. The cattle operation grew, carefully and sustainably, adding to the herd only as much as the land could well support, because Abel was a man who respected the land he worked, and Ada had come to share that respect entirely. Ada's role on the ranch evolved as naturally as everything else had. The books were hers completely, and she managed the ranch's financial records with a precision that impressed even the bank manager in Cimarron, who had initially received a woman presenting the ranch's accounts with a skepticism that she had then methodically and completely dismantled with 4 years of impeccable documentation. She managed the household and the garden and the correspondence and, increasingly, the relationships with the neighboring ranches and the community in Cimarron, because she had a gift for people that Abel, who was better with cattle and land, acknowledged freely and without ego. Their first child arrived in the winter of 1884, a boy they named James, which had been Abel's father's name. He was born in the bedroom with the mountain view, delivered by a midwife from Cimarron, and Abel sat outside the door for 4 hours in a state of barely contained terror that he expressed by whittling a piece of wood into something that might have been a horse and might have been a fence post, the result being somewhat ambiguous. When Ada called him in and put the baby into his arms, he stood very still for a moment, looking at this small new person with an expression of such wondering disbelief that Ada, who was exhausted and relieved and feeling all the enormous emotions of the occasion, started to cry. "He is very small," Abel said. "Babies often are," Ada said. "He has your nose," Abel said, with something in his voice that she recognized as the beginnings of the specific, devastating love that parents developed for their children, audible even in its very early stages. "Good," she said. "Your nose would be a great deal on a face this size." He looked at her, and she laughed, and he laughed, and James, who had apparently not been consulted about this moment, exercised his extremely functional lungs. James was a quiet, observant baby who grew into a quiet, observant child, clearly his father's son in temperament, watching everything carefully before committing to an opinion. He was on a horse by the time he was 4, naturally and without drama, because he had grown up watching horses in the way that children who grow up on ranches regard the animals as simply part of the furniture of the world. Abel taught him to ride with the patient, thorough attention he brought to everything he considered worth teaching, and Ada watched from the fence and felt the specific joy of seeing 2 people you love becoming known to each other. A second child came in 1886, a girl named Nora Ruth, carrying both grandmothers in one name, and she was from the beginning a person of pronounced opinions and direct action who had her mother's coloring and her father's determination, and an entirely original personality that seemed to have been issued to her specifically for the purpose of keeping the household on its toes. She was fearless and curious, and she followed Court around from the time she could walk, treating him as a mobile information source regarding the ranch. And Court, who had never had children and had perhaps not known until this point that he had wanted them, became something like a grandfather to her in every way that mattered. The ranch hands changed and stayed over the years. Birch eventually moved on, as young men do, going north to Wyoming to work on a bigger operation. And Ada packed him a bundle of food for the journey and told him that he had to write. And he promised he would. And he did, actually, for several years, until the letters slowed and then stopped in the way that letters do when lives diverge, and the distance becomes too great to maintain in writing. Segundo stayed, because the Winslow Ranch was the only ranch he had ever worked, and it was as much his as anyone's in the ways that matter when you have given a piece of your life to a place. Walt, the quiet man who washed his dishes, surprised everyone by marrying a schoolteacher from Cimarron named Helen, who was 32 and direct and found Walt's silence restful rather than alarming. And they built a small house on a piece of land adjacent to the Winslow property that Abel sold him at a price that was so far below market value that Ada had to audit the paperwork twice before accepting that she had read it correctly. "He has worked for us for 7 years, Abel said when she raised her eyebrow at the price. 7 years does not equal free land, she said. It is not free, he said. I charged him something. Abel. He has a wife now, Abel said, with the finality of a man ending an argument he has already won in his own mind. He needs a house. Ada had looked at him, this man she had married, this steady and generous and infuriating and extraordinary man, and she had kissed him on the cheek and said, "You are impossible," and he had said, "You have mentioned that before," and they had looked at each other and they were both smiling. The territory of New Mexico continued its slow evolution toward statehood, which would not come until 1912, but which everyone in the territory seemed to be perpetually on the verge of expecting. And the railroad had long since changed the nature of life in the region, bringing more people and more commerce and more complication to a land that had previously been characterized by its resistance to complication. Cimarron itself grew, added a proper school and a church with a permanent minister, and a hotel that had real glass in every window. And the Winslow Ranch changed with the times, adapting and growing and remaining, through all of it, fundamentally itself. There were hard years. There were years when the cattle prices dropped, and the calculations in Ada's ledgers were grim and required careful management to navigate. There was a drought in 1888 that took 2 years to fully recover from, and a bad winter in 1890 that cost them a portion of the herd to cold and disease, and required Abel to ride for days in weather that Ada watched from the windows with her heart in her throat. There were the ordinary sorrows of a life lived in a hard country, neighbors lost, friendships ended by distance or death, the particular grief of watching the people you love age and diminish. Segundo retired in 1891, 63 years old and moving more slowly, and Ada organized a farewell dinner that lasted half a day, and at which Segundo gave a speech in both Spanish and English that made the women cry and the men stare at the ceiling. He went to live with his daughter's family in the valley, and Abel visited him regularly, and this seemed right. Court never retired. Court simply became, over the years, a more senior version of himself on the ranch, doing less of the heavy physical labor and more of the teaching and advising that was the natural province of a man who had accumulated 40 years of knowledge about cattle and horses, and the specific behavior of this particular piece of land in all its moods and seasons. He was 70 years old and still had his opinions about the proper way to manage a fence line, and anyone who worked on the Winslow Ranch knew better than to challenge those opinions, unless they were prepared for a very thorough and highly detailed response. James, at 10, was already learning the ranch in the serious, systematic way that suggested he had always intended to inherit it. He rode out with Abel regularly, not as a novelty but as a small, earnest apprentice, and Abel taught him everything, the land, the water, the animals, the accounts, with a patience and thoroughness that Ada found, watching it, almost unbearably beautiful. This was the thing she had been given, she thought sometimes, in the long evenings when the children were in bed, and she and Abel were sitting in the parlor by the fire with the ranch quiet around them. Not just a marriage and a home, but a life that had depth and meaning running all the way through it, like grain in good wood. In the summer of 1893, Ruth came to visit with her children. She and Henry had 3 now, a girl of 12 and twin boys of 8 who regarded the ranch with the focused enthusiasm of boys who had been raised in Ohio and never seen cattle worked at close range. The visit lasted 3 weeks and was, by general agreement, one of the finest 3 weeks the ranch had seen in years. Ruth and Ada walked every evening after supper, down toward the river and back, talking in the way that sisters talk who have been apart for too long and are catching up on the interior life that letters can only sketch. Ruth said on the last evening of her visit, standing by the river in the last light, "You are happy." "Yes," Ada said, "completely." Ada thought about this honestly the way she thought about everything. "There are days that are hard," she said. "There are things I miss. I miss Ohio sometimes, miss having you near." She paused. "But yes, completely. In the ways that count, completely." Ruth took her hand and held it for a moment. "Mother would have been so proud of you," she said. Ada looked at the river. "I like to think so," she said. "Not just of this," Ruth said, gesturing at the ranch, the land, the life. "Of you, of who you are. You came out here alone after everything with nothing but 23 cents and a letter, and you built something real." Ada was quiet for a moment, feeling the truth of it settle into her like water into dry ground. "I had help," she said. "You had yourself first," Ruth said firmly, "and then you had help." Abel found them coming back up the path from the river and walked beside Ada the rest of the way to the house with his hand easy and warm around hers, and Ruth walked slightly ahead giving them the gift of distance, and the evening was golden and full around them, the mountains holding their eternal position at the edge of the sky. Ruth left the next morning and the ranch went back to itself, its daily rhythms and seasonal patterns and the particular music of a life well made. The years moved. James turned 16, then 17, then 18, and was by that time doing a man's share of the work on the ranch with a competence that made his father look at him sometimes with an expression that was entirely, privately proud. Nora Ruth turned 16 in 1902 and was conducting a vigorous campaign for the right to participate more fully in the ranch's cattle operations, a campaign she pressed with the logical tenacity of a born advocate, and to which Abel was, Ada could see, slowly and inevitably conceding because his daughter's arguments were usually sound, and because she reminded him, when she was being particularly determined, of her mother. One morning in the spring of 1903, Ada stood on the porch in the early light. She was 45 years old, and she stood straight and easy in herself, in the way of a woman who has done the work of becoming the person she intended to be and found the work worth it. The kitchen garden was behind her, planted and flourishing. The books were in their order in the parlor. The ranch was sound and productive. Her children were growing into people she genuinely liked, which was the thing that surprised her most about parenthood, the way your children became not just people you loved, but people you would have chosen to know. Abel came out with 2 cups of coffee, the way he had been coming out with 2 cups of coffee for 21 years, and handed her one, and stood beside her looking at the morning. The mountains were lit rose and gold at their peaks, the valley below the ranch still in blue shadow, the river invisible but audible, running cold and quick in its bed. The cottonwoods were in their first pale green, and somewhere in the fields a meadowlark was singing with the particular excess of joy that meadowlarks bring to spring mornings, as though they have thought about it all winter and cannot contain themselves any longer. "James wants to take the herd to the eastern pasture this week," Abel said. "Told me," Ada said. "He has been thinking about it since January." "He is right that the grass will be better there this spring," Abel said. "I checked the water situation yesterday. It will support it." "Tell him that," Ada said. "Tell him he was right." Abel looked at her sideways. "I usually just tell him the decision and let him draw the conclusion." "Tell him he was right," she said again. "He needs to hear it from you." A pause. "Yes," Abel said. "All right." She smiled into her coffee. They stood on the porch in the morning, side by side, the way they had stood on this porch in the winter and the summer and the spring and the fall, through 21 years of mornings, and the land lay before them, their land, earned and known and loved, and the mountains were where they always were, and the sky was enormous and clear. And Ada thought of a stagecoach and a letter and a room she had walked into in the evening light to find an old woman with sharp, dark eyes who had looked at her and said, "My Ada," with the certainty of someone who knew what they were putting in motion. "Abel," he said, "are you happy?" He turned to look at her, and his face, 21 years familiar, was entirely unguarded in the morning light, as it was in the evening sometimes, and in the moments when he forgot to be contained, which happened more and more often as the years had loosened something in him that the early years of solitude had drawn tight. "Yes," he said, simply and without qualification. "Entirely." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch of the ranch that Nora Winslow had built, and that they had made into something both larger and more complete than either of them could have built alone. And the meadowlark sang on with the abandon of a creature that has never been required to be careful about joy. And the morning kept coming in, golden and relentless and very beautiful, over the mountains that had always been there, watching and permanent and still. James came out 20 minutes later and found them on the porch and looked at them with the slightly embarrassed fondness of an 18-year-old who has grown up watching his parents love each other and has come to regard it as the most ordinary and most extraordinary feature of his world. "The horses are ready," he said. "Good," Abel said, and set down his coffee cup and straightened and put on his hat and looked once more at Ada, who was still standing with the morning light full on her face. "Coming," he said. "In a moment," she said. He went, and she stayed for one more minute, looking at the land and the sky and the mountains, at this life that had been given to her by circumstance and kept by choice. And then she set down her coffee and went in to begin the day, which was what she had always done, what she would always do, with a full heart and steady hands, in the country she had come to buy a battered trunk and 23 cents, and the extraordinary mercy of an old woman who had arranged everything before she left.